Hello YouTube, and welcome to a new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today we're doing a video that's a bit different than normal, and honestly I have no idea why anyone would even watch this, but today we're talking about poverty in the Elder Scrolls universe. Specifically, which provinces are the poorest, why they're poor, and what's keeping the people in it poor. That said, I have incorporated some real-world economic principles in this video, so I hope that in the end of the day you might actually learn something from this video, as, I don't know, I think it might be less interesting to some than my regular videos, but we'll see how it turns out. Next week we'll have a regular video again. Alright, so before we can talk about poverty in the Elder Scrolls universe, we need to define poverty. Now, in our world we have two types of poverty. You have absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is just a general term that we use for the very bare minimum that somebody could need to have their basic needs met, which is $1.25 per day. But some of you watching this video might already think, well, $1.25 per day is not enough to beat my basic needs, so that's why we have relative poverty, as in many countries around the world $1.25 per day is not enough to meet your basic needs. So that's why we have relative poverty, meaning that a person is on the low end of the median income of the country. To explain it simply, goods here in Europe are generally far more expensive to buy than goods in, for example, Africa. This all has to do with the value of different currencies and many more factors which you don't have time to get into. This means that while someone in Africa might have a relatively high income and is able to buy whatever they want in Africa, they might be on the low end of the income in a European country if they were living here. This would mean that they, even though they are rich in Africa and can buy everything they need there, they would be poor here in Europe standards and might have trouble to get by. That's very basically relative poverty explained. Of course, there are other definitions of poverty. One I personally like is the definition by the economist Amartya Sen, which describes that poverty is not necessarily related to income, but is rather related to freedom. While this definition has many aspects to it, it comes down to having the freedom to live your life the way you want to. So you need to have the freedom to find a job, get income, then pay for your expenses. But also have the freedom to have personal property that's protected by the law so others can steal it. Any obstructions to those kind of freedoms by, let's say, Red Mountain eruption on Tamriel, which destroys your city, or bandit activity close to your village, contributes to your poverty status as it takes away your freedoms. So before we can actually start with the analysis of Tamriel, in case there are any developmental experts in the comments that are already angrily typing their comments, there is also a distinct difference between structural poverty and cyclical poverty. Cyclical poverty is tied to the economic cycles of a country or an economic zone, and it's the kind of poverty that comes with economic depressions in our own world and is inherently temporary. But since we don't have that kind of economic data for the Elder Scrolls universe, we will strictly be talking about structural poverty here, which means that poverty is not just a temporary thing and not just linked to the economic cycle, but has more factors pitching into it. Alright, this took some time to lay the groundwork, but now let's apply what I just told you to Tamriel. The first thing we generally think about when someone mentions poverty in the Elder Scrolls universe are the beggars that we can find in many of the games. These beggars are unemployed, homeless people that are deprived of essentially all freedoms to live their life the way they want to live it and can't really meet their own needs. They are forced to beg on the streets essentially. These beggars live in all the provinces, and I would guess that under any normal circumstances the percentual amount of beggars per province would be the same across basically every province with maybe slight variations. While we obviously don't have any concrete numbers, and most of this is guesswork, so don't take anything that I'm about to tell you for granted, we can theorize a bit as to the amount of beggars in each of the provinces. I would guess that percent-wise, Hammerfell, Blackmarsh and Cyrodiil would have the most beggars due to the situation each of those provinces is in. While I think that percent-wise, Somerset Isles will have the least amount of beggars. Let's start with the Somerset Isles. I assume that it's likely that poverty does exist, especially for servants and possible slaves on Somerset, but they will probably not have a lot of beggars, if at all. I think this is the case because the Thalmor wish to create a near-perfect society on the Somerset Isles, meaning that they most likely got rid of homeless beggars by either making them into servants, soldiers, slaves, or just deporting them, or, in the most extreme case, simply killing them off. While the High Elves have always cared to a large extent about the outward appearances of their island, the Thalmor have taken this principle to a whole new level, and thus I speculate that the way they mostly handled the beggars is that they simply removed them from society. In the case of Hammerfell, I presume that there are a lot of beggars because the Great War devastated a lot of the province and killed and wounded or destroyed the livelihood of many of its citizens. While it's been a while since the war, I personally suspect that rebuilding Hammerfell's economy, especially after it left the economic zone of the Empire, and considering its apparent lack of resources, would go quite slowly, and that a lot of the permanently wounded people during the Great War are by now beggars, as they've a disadvantaged position in comparison to healthy workers, and by now they're getting old, meaning that a lot of the Great War veterans most likely turned beggar by this time. It's probably the same case in Cyrodiil, where a large portion of the province was destroyed due to the war, but Cyrodiil has the advantage of being in the same economic zone of Skyrim and High Rock, and it's being the center of the Empire, making the economy recovery much less of a problem than it would be for Hammerfell. Although, you do need to remember that this is all assuming that Hammerfell stayed fully independent and had trouble rebuilding its economy after the war, which would mean that a lot of the veterans would be left homeless and poor. If Hammerfell performed a lot better than in my personal speculation, we would see a completely different picture, so don't take any of my words just for granted at first glance. In the case of Black Mars, we know that humans, elves and Khajiit get discriminated against by the Ancihil government. Anyone that's not an Argonian and that doesn't have special permission by the Ancihil is forbidden to enter their cities or venture very far into the province. Therefore, we know from the book The Infernal City that there are a lot of poor non-Argonians that reverted to being beggars in front of the cities and ports. However, do keep in mind that the Infernal City novels are set more than a century before Skyrim, so in the end we can't be sure whether the situation changed at all or what it's like now. My final point on the topic of beggars is Morrowind. While a lot of people have always assumed that Morrowind is very poor and thus must have a lot of beggars, it has now almost been 2 centuries since the eruption of the Red Mountain, therefore I would not be so sure whether Morrowind could have recovered economically, or at least it probably has recovered to a point where there aren't as many beggars, at least not because of the Red Mountain eruption. This is because that we know that a lot of the destroyed cities have in fact been rebuilt by now, and that volcanic ash in the soil can actually be very beneficial for farming after a long time. Obviously not in the immediate aftermath of an eruption, but later on. That, in combination with Morrowind's natural resources and the fact that most of the wounded people from the war against the Argonians would have died by now, make it so that Morrowind has a healthy population with a large economic potential. So that's why I assume that Morrowind likely doesn't have as many beggars as, say, Hammerfell or Cyrodiil. It really depends on how Morrowind has dealt with the aftermath of the wars and of the aftermath of their other catastrophes, and for how much longer after the eruption of the mountain it kept fuming ash across the provinces. While we know that Vardenfell still gets ash storms from time to time, we don't know how the rest of Morrowind fares. What's interesting is that the majority of these beggars, as I said before, are either very old, sick or permanently wounded. This is most likely because of something else that we see in the Elder Scrolls universe: banditism. In the Elder Scrolls universe there's always been an abundance of criminals of all ages of our protagonists slain. While most beggars are frail and weak, it's quite likely that most of the populace that became homeless and unemployed on Tamriel simply became bandits, thieves, smugglers, etc. As to many of them, that may seem like an easy way to make some septims. The fact that most poor people in good health likely become bandits, in turn of course contributes to robbing others of their money and property, and thus contributes to making others poorer. This is why I personally assume that Skyrim right now is the relatively poorest province of them all. Most of the province is tied up in a civil war right now, which raises the prices for food and other essential goods, meaning that the income needed to provide for yourself becomes higher, and thus a lot of the people will have a harder time to provide for themselves. Parallel with this, we know that the civil war drains the holds of their guards and makes a lot of people homeless. This results in more people resorting to the life of a bandit, and that bandits are more effective altogether because there's less protection against them. This most likely means that Skyrim is the province with the most relative poverty, with more and more people that would generally have a normal income now struggling to provide for themselves due to the war. And while Skyrim has some natural resources like silver in the Reach, that too is being threatened by war, bandits or Forsworn. Think back to your Skyrim playthroughs. I think that over half the mines in Skyrim have been overrun by bandits. Generally only those in towns next to trade routes or those of strategic importance are still held by official owners. Most others have simply been taken by bandits or other vagabonds. This all is why I think that Skyrim is most likely the poorest province at the moment, maybe in parallel with some regions within Hammerfell if Hammerfell is economically struggling. While most of the coastal regions of Hammerfell should be fine as these produce spices and other goods, Many of Hammerfell's more rural regions are most likely in a similar situation to Skyrim, with bandits holed up in most of these places. Cyrodiil, on the other side, is a bit of an uncertain case. While we know that it was devastated during the war, at the same time it's the center of the Empire's economic zone and the center of its trading network. A lot of the wealth and taxes end up here, and I personally speculate that Cyrodiil has recovered quite well since the war, to at least the point it was at before the war, as the Empire would have given great priority to restoring Cyrodiil, both in a military and economic aspect, making it sure that the Empire could stand against the Thalmor in an eventual Second Great War. The final Imperial province, High Rock, is probably doing the best of the three, as while we know that pirate rates have definitely increased, we also know that High Rock is still very mercantile and trades a lot with the other provinces. So in terms of poverty, I would expect High Rock to have the lowest amount of poor citizens compared to Skyrim and Cyrodiil of the Empire, maybe even across of Tamriel. That said, Somerset Isles is largely in the similar states to High Rock, where everything is going economically fine most likely. I would suspect that the Thalmor would try to get everything in order for the Somerset residents to keep the popular support, so I would also suspect that there isn't a lot of poverty in general on the Isles, maybe except for slaves and servants. Valenwood, Blackmares and elsewhere are all just, well, relatively unknown. While I've been able to reasonably speculate on the other provinces, we have no idea how these provinces are doing. The only tiny thing that I can say is that most likely Valenwood and elsewhere get exploited to some extent by the Somerset Isles to keep their things prosperous on the islands, in the same fashion of how Cyrodiil benefits from the other Imperial provinces. This is because Somerset is the center of the Altmerry economic zone and its seat of power. But other than that, there isn't really much to speculate on for both cases, due to Elswere's relative autonomy from the Dominion, with it being client states and direct provinces. There is a chance that they might be able to make their own trade deals with the Empire and Blackmoors, so actually Elsewere might be doing a little bit better or a bit worse than, for example, Valenwood. But we don't really know, but we do know that there's a large chance of it being exploited by the Somerset Isles, just like Valenwood. The final speculation that I'm doing is on Morrowind, which I already touched on earlier. I think that Morrowind has most likely recovered quite well by now, as it's been more than 150 years since their most recent province-wide tragedy. And we know that many cities have already been rebuilt since the Red Year. Due to its abundance in natural resources, I think that Morrowind trades a lot with the Empire, as it's their most logical trading partner, since they basically hate the Argonians. And thus I suspect that while Morrowind likely does have some poverty, it's likely at a similar level to High Rock, where a large part of the population is actually generally prosperous. That said, I do wish to make another remark before I end this video. Specifically, I wish to talk about corruption. In our own world, corruption contributes hugely to keeping people poor, as in general, corruption means people need to spend more money to access services. In some countries around the world, an average person will spend around 10% of their income in bribing government personnel, police, traders, etc. This means that a portion of the income is just completely lost to them and keeps them poor. The people of Tamriel are notoriously corrupt. Depending on your speech level, money and station, almost everybody in Tamriel is bribable for you. This of course contributes very much to keeping the people in poverty. For example, since guards can be bribed if I stole something from a citizen in the game, that citizen will never be compensated for the crime, making them poorer than they already were. Or if government officials abuse their power to get personal gain, the people will also be kept poor. A prime example of this is the quest with Yvette San and Vittoria Vici of the East Empire Trading Company. There Vittoria is basically demanding a personal bribe to release Yvette San's shipment of spiced wine. These kind of things are widespread around Tamriel and thus will keep people poor, meaning that in poor provinces there isn't really much of a chance for people to improve their situation. So, that's basically all I can say on this topic. This video was a bit incoherent, I know, but it was something I really wanted to get out, as I've been researching this for quite a long while now and I wasn't going to let this research, linger any longer. That said, I hope you still did enjoy this video. If you didn't, well, expect a normal video next week when I post a new video. And if you like this video, consider liking, subscribing so you see the next video. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Before I end it, allow me to vocally thank my top patrons, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Mr. Metanoid1v1, Mr. Gabriel Binda, Mr. Christmas, and Mr. Para. These guys, along with the others on screen, make my weekly lore spheres possible and make it so that I can, justify to myself doing so much research on, well, trivial topics in the Elder Scrolls universe, like the video I did today. I worked on it a very long time, and in the end, I'm not really sure whether I like the outcome. So if you're still listening by now, I know that I already get a lot of criticism comments, but I would really I don't know how to say that. I would really appreciate it if you left a comment on this video on what you thought, if you disliked it or if you liked it. Let me know what I could have improved, because with this video especially, I felt a bit insecure whether I should even post it or not. But you know, now that I'm recording it, it's Wednesday and I don't have time to do another video before tomorrow. So I wanted to get my research out of here because I've worked really hard on it. So yeah, I hope you liked it and let me know. Bye bye.